Hello again, everyone. Thank you for joining me for Phibbs the Druid podcast. I am your host, Phibbs. Today I'm going to be talking about card advantage in mono green EDH. So let's dig right into it. First of all, I think it's extremely important to point out some really powerful effects that you can jam into pretty much any green deck, anything that's running green. For example, Sylvan Library, Font of Mythos, and Greater Good are some very potent effects that can consistently generate card advantage, but all three of these are very, very different. Mono green has kind of a weird relationship with card advantage, whereas blue typically just has hard card draw with things like, just for example, divination or blue sun zenith. Green is really dependent on its creatures usually, but there's also some colorless effects like Font of Mythos, which I mentioned earlier, Howling Mine. What's the other one? Mind's Eye, that you can just jam into pretty much any deck. But yeah, let's get into looking at some of these very powerful effects. So Sylvan Library, it's pretty much the all-star of green card advantage. It's an enchantment for 1 and a green that says, at the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, you choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put the card on top of your library. So, admittedly, when I first got my hands on Sylvan Library and started using it in my decks, I was actually, not only was I overcautious using it by paying the life, but I think I was using it incorrectly. So, essentially, you draw 3 cards during your draw step, and then you choose which cards out of those 3 that you're going to keep. If you keep 2 of the cards, you lose 4 life. If you keep all 3, you lose 8 life. And if you only keep 1 of the cards out of the 3 drawn, you lose no life. This may seem like a lot of life to be losing each turn for the sake of card advantage, but in the first turns, when this is out, refilling your hand for 8 life is totally worth it. Later, when you no longer can afford this life loss, Sylvan Library can pretty much just turn into a brainstorm effect, where essentially you're scrying 3 and drawing 1, which is in and of itself pretty powerful. So Font of Mythos is an artifact for 4 that simply states, at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws 2 additional cards. So this is a colorless artifact. And I will say it up front, this card is not for everybody. This card is not for every deck. But considering that it is colorless, you can jam it into anything that struggles with maintaining consistent card advantage. I run this in my Multani because I constantly want to be refilling the whole table's hands because it grows Multani. But even if this is your only kind of group hug card, i.e. a card that benefits the whole table over time, including your opponents, this card essentially turns into draw 3 cards per turn and repeat. Last I checked, it was a bit pricey. I think it was somewhere in between $10 and $20. If you don't really want to help out your opponents, I get it, but if you're brave, you'll give it a try. Greater Good is an enchantment for 2 and green that states, sacrifice a creature, draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, and then discard 3 cards. I'll admit, I actually haven't really played around with this one that much, other than online. So I haven't really played around with it in paper, even though, oh yeah, I don't have a copy of this right now, but I should pick one up. But in decks that want sacrifice outlets, like Lumra or Eudora, I can imagine this enchantment would put in a lot of work. So like, say this is like the 3rd or 4th time you've cast your Lumra. It's now like a 24/24. Sack Lumra, draw 24 cards, discard 3. So it's draw 21, refill your graveyard with more lands, then you can cast Lumra again. Seems pretty good. It should be noted that this enchantment is an instant speed sacrifice outlet, and as such is pretty powerful when your opponent is dropping something like a Wrath of God or even a farewell on the board because you can refill your hand and just keep the best out of the cards you draw. If you have, for instance, 4 large creatures out, you can draw as many as 20 or more cards at instant speed, and then only the downside would be that you'd be losing like 12 out of the 20 drawn. But still, you're keeping the best cards so that you can have a pretty explosive follow-up turn to that Wrath. I've built many EDH decks over the last 10 years. And I've even built a couple of mono blue decks as well. My last mono blue deck was Jin Gataxius, the Saga one. And although it did draw a ton of cards, as blue is known to do, in my opinion, from my personal experience, it has been my mono green decks that have always drawn me more cards. For instance, my Multani Maro Sorcerer, yes, I will be referring to this deck a lot because Multani is my all-time favorite, has regularly drawn me half of my library, or more, with a single spell. Something like Return of the Wild Speaker or Momentous Fall just draws me a bunch of cards. Like, we're talking like drawing like 40 cards in a turn off of one spell. Which brings me to my first examples of some more card advantage in mono green. Return of the Wild Speaker, originally from Throne of Eldraine, one of my personal favorite sets of all time, is an instant for 4 and green that says, choose one. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. This card is pretty wild. Especially in decks that can push out obscenely large creatures that scale with like a particular resource, like Multani of course, but also legends like Lumra, as I mentioned earlier, or Ashaya of the Wild. These are just 2 examples, so feel free to slap this very powerful instant into any deck that cares about large, non-human creatures, Eldrazi, stuff like that. It can also be irrelevant temporary anthem in decks that go wide, like Elves or Merfolk, that can push through enough damage to close out a game. I really like this card because it's modal. It's a draw spell and a pump effect, and sometimes when you don't need the draw anymore, you can just cash it in and win on the spot with this card. Momentous Fall and Life's Legacy are very similar cards, with the exception that one is slightly better than the other, in my opinion, because you can cast it at instant speed, as well as the added life gain benefit. Momentous Fall is an instant for 2 and green that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. You draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then you gain life equal to its toughness. Pretty simple. This card, as well as Life's Legacy, are great inclusions in decks that don't mind tossing your creatures into the graveyard to reap the benefits. Legends like Eudora, Grave Gardener could easily make use of these powerful effects. I've mentioned Eudora a couple times, especially these sacrifice effects. Really great. Next, I want to talk about what I call the consistent draw engines, depending on your build, of course, that you can almost universally throw into any mono green EDH deck. There's a lot of them. This section has become larger over time, and you'll notice that, per usual, this kind of card advantage is intrinsically linked to creatures that you either are casting, or creatures entering the battlefield under your control, or you already control a very large creature. This intrinsic link is pretty universal across the board when it comes to mono green, so if playing lots of creatures in the course of an EDH game isn't your thing, then maybe you just aren't the druid that I was hoping you turned out to be. So first up, let's look at the king and queen of consistent card advantage in mono green. Guardian Project and the Great Henge. Should be noted that the Great Henge is an extremely expensive single to get your hands on these days. I actually ended up buying 2 boxes of Throne of Eldraine a couple years ago to acquire one of these. But as of right now, the cheapest printing of the Great Henge is sitting at $63, and that kind of goes up and down all over the place. It's usually sitting 60 plus, sometimes it gets up to like 80 or more. So The Great Henge is a legendary artifact for 7 and green green that says, this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So, again, that intrinsic link to big creatures, or just creatures in general. Then it also says, tap, add green green, you gain 2 life. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on it and draw a card. So this is a ramp piece, a life gain piece, a 1/1 counter piece, and a card advantage piece, all wrapped up into one. So as you can see, it does pretty much everything you'd want an engine like this to do, hence the demand, the price tag. This card's also great in decks that don't care about tokens, decks that can cheat it out early with the cost reduction, decks that care about 1/1 counters, as I mentioned, and even decks that care about life gain. The 2 life gain, it's not that much, but, you know, it does when you're playing that game of attrition and you're really going down in life totals. I think my copy of this card is currently sitting in my Dionys Elvish Archdruid deck, currently because my plan is to go as wide as possible in that deck. So playing a lot of low-costed mana dorks and utility elves, which can snowball into some big turns if I can keep this artifact in play. Next we have Guardian Project. For 3 and green, this enchantment says, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, so again, like Great Henge, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control, or a creature in your graveyard, draw a card. So this card is, I think it was back from like the War of the Spark block. It's like Guilds of Ravnica or one of those two when this came out. But yeah, this was pretty much made for EDH. EDH was already established as a format when this came out, and it pretty much puts in, if you can resolve it and keep it around, it's probably the best rate 1-for-1. At least it's like a cantrip, kind of, because you're playing a creature, you're drawing a creature, you're playing a creature, you're drawing something else, maybe not a creature. But again, this card doesn't work with tokens, and it doesn't work with multiple copies of the same creature. So, hence, it's perfect for EDH, which is a singleton format where you're always playing a unique creature, unless, you know, you're playing something like, at least in mono green, you're playing like Slime Against Humanity or something. That would never trigger this. Cards are great. You can run it into any of your mono green decks, and it will draw you some pretty solid advantage. It's also low pip costed, so you can play it in stuff outside of mono green. Next up, we have Up the Beanstalk. For 1 and green, this enchantment says, when Up the Beanstalk enters the battlefield, and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, you draw a card. Note that this draw engine doesn't just care about creatures, but any and all spells you cast that are 5 converted mana cost or greater. Also notice that the 5 CMC plus spell doesn't even have to resolve to get the card advantage. So it could just be on cast, you're still getting it back. You're still getting that card advantage back. Sure, most of the spells that are 5+ you'll be casting in mono green are going to be creatures more often than not. But this awesome enchantment will also draw you cards off things like Rishkar's Expertise or big X spells like, say, Finale of Devastation. I could go over all of the images I've included in this section, but they are pretty self-explanatory, and I want to get to more big draw spells since I've referenced Rishkar's Expertise now. Rishkar's Expertise is a sorcery for 4 and green, right? Yeah, so it's a 6-drop. 4 and green that says, draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Again, same thing. So that big creature is involved again. And then you may cast a spell with mana value 5 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. The broad adoption of this card into EDH in general, especially mono green, is not by accident. This card is an absolute house. It doesn't target, so if your large commander happens to have Shroud because they have some Lightning Greaves on it, or happens to be named Multani Maro Sorcerer, which has which has Shroud inherently, Rishkar's Expertise just doesn't care and will still resolve. But wait, there's more. We also get to cast something 5 or less from our hand for free. Anything. Amazing value. I can't speak highly enough of this card. Please, please play this more. The card always puts in a lot of work. Next up, there's Shamanic Revelation, which is a sorcery for 3 and green that says, draw a card for each creature you control. Ferocious. You gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. So the Ferocious ability is only active when you control a creature with power 4 or greater. So you might not always not get that sweet life gain off this, but in a deck that cares about going wide, this deck will put in a lot of work. Easily draw you 5 or more cards immediately. Elves, Druids, even landfall decks that use Scoot Swarm will draw a lot of cards with Shamanic Revelation. Regal Force. It's also a creature that will go into go wide strategies as well for 4 and green. So 7 converted mana cost. This 5/5 elemental says, when Regal Force enters, draw a card for each green creature you control. Pretty simple. What's nice is that this effect is attached to a creature, which can be reanimated or bounced or flickered if you have something like a Conjurer's Closet in your deck. But even if you're not abusing the creature in this way, the effect of drawing like maybe 5 or more cards late game can really give you the edge that you're looking for. All 3 of these cards are pretty cheap financially and pretty easy to get hold of because they've been printed a bunch of times. There's a ton of other card advantage spells in mono green, not nearly as many straight draws spells as in other colors like blue or black with things like Divination or Sign in Blood, but there's always enough to fit whatever strategy you're aiming towards. For this week, I've continued my new tradition of brewing up another mono green legend in alphabetical order, mind you. This week I put a list together for Altanak Thrice Called. This is a weird one, but I do like the direction that the deck goes in. So check out the deck list in the description. Thanks for watching and or listening to me talk about card advantage for a little bit. Let me know in the comments what your favorite card advantage spells are in mono green. I know that I've probably missed a few important ones, and cheers. Thanks for listening.